Okay, so this is a poem, really one of her, I'll say, foundational poems.
Signature work.
Signature work by Carolyn Forche. It's an early work. She has many others, and she is the also compiler of a book, Poems of Witness, and she has and Poems Against Forgetting is the first anthology, and the other is Poems of Witness.
But does she make a real living writing poetry? It would seem like she does.
I think so, because she teaches.
Yeah.
Anybody who teaches, and she has positions, although she's been, has been in different places. But anyway, her Against Forgetting is the first anthology, which came after some of these works. Those are poems of, I would say, 20th century responses to things, and the Poetry of Witness goes back to anchor it in the long-standing English history. So we go, all the way back to Renaissance, etc., with poems that responded in some way to the issues of state politics, government, state of the world, whatever. And there's some very interesting things about Poems of Witness that I'd like to address after this. So there is the thing itself, this poem, and what it is to witness as an issue. And then there is the what does it mean to witness? And what does it do when things that are referred to here are ongoing in the world? Where do they come from? And what effect does it have to merely witness? So one of the issues, so I'm just foregrounding this, one of the issues is you're witnessing here as if you're a reporter. But it doesn't go to analyzing what brings this about and what is it persistent. And there are people who have done that. Pound tried to do that, but his theory was inaccurate. So in the cantos, he does reference political theory, but it was bad theory. And there are, something that I will bring up later, but there is someone who was Canadian who responded to slaughters in Indonesia and did an entire statement because of where he was positioned, class, etc., of trying to spell out, in this sense, the entire American empire and how it worked. And it's quite eloquent. So I'm addressing this partly because of the printout that I got, that Al's statement that the difference between prose and poetry is when the language dominates the sense is more important. And I wish to dispute that. I think that is not adequate because for people that have written certain kinds of witness, the language is very important. I mean, flat prose is flat prose, but a prose poem may not have a plot exactly, but the sensibility is very important too, equally. So I think to take a poem like this poem and to say the language is more important than the sense, I think we have to question that.
Yeah. Well, her background as a activist, very activist person that was involved with Amnesty International and two specific occasions where she obviously was in direct conflict with the American foreign policy at the time.
Yes.
And that she had the courage that she had to confront that
and Joan Didion, who happened to be present.
Absolutely.
So
isn't the story of this poem is that she was commissioned by a magazine or something to go down.
Well, she had
to go down to where this fellow was, sort of like a magazine reporter, and see what was going on.
No, I think she had a foundation grant. I think it was Amnesty, maybe, or I have to go back because I have a lot of things I read, and I just have to tell you, it's been a hard week. I mean, we've had a death in the family and other things, so I haven't had as much.
Sorry.
Yeah, so So I didn't quite get a chance to review all the things that I had reviewed earlier. But yes, she was in Salvador, and she left the week before the bishop was murdered in the cathedral. But so if we look directly at the poem, obviously you see that it's in prose form, like a paragraph, and then we have to look at the specific language and the way it's capped also, what you have heard. So it assumes you've heard, right? Which of course is not necessarily true. But it is true. I was in his house. So you're still not sure, other than that you see the title. You were in the colonel's house. And then you have this everyday kind of thing, which the wife carried a tray of coffee and sugar. It's all very civilized. His daughter filed her nails, and that has kind of a cold, for me as I read it, she is conscious of nails and is not treating guests with any kind of respect. So she's kind of a spoiled brat, let's say. And his son went out for the night. And that's all very sort of normal. Daily papers, pet dogs, that's normal. And then a pistol on the cushion beside him, right there, you know. He's got this pistol. The moon swung bare on its black cord over the house. And I think that is a really interesting sentence because
you suggesting like
he's suggesting a torture chamber, you know, where you have that's the way I read it.
Just generally hanging.
Well, yes, but also how, you know, you might have a one light that's there, and it's a black cord, and it's over the house.
Very good.
So, and on the television was a cop show, like good guys and bad guys, very simplistic, and the fact that it's in English. And I think that's pretty interesting that you're sitting in Salvador and you have this show in English, which may be intended to point toward the influence of those who speak that language and their role in the colonel's world.
From the poem, do we know it is in El Salvador?
Yeah. We know it's Salvador. The country between us, it's quite specific. This is the book that it comes from.
I was just looking the poem itself, whether it...
But there are other poems related in this.
Oh, I have no doubt.
You know,
I was just...
Yeah, so I think we do know that it's Salvador. Let me see.
No, and I'm not doubting it. I was just trying to see
I think to answer Kurt's question, you have to have a little bit of background.
Well, not only that,
to know that.
If you look at it, it's in the set of things that say in Salvador.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it doesn't matter because there are colonels everywhere.
That's another point.
He's an archetype of this
fellow.
And
he's an archetype, but he's specific, and that's, you know, as a literary form or whatever, to make it specific is, you know, more compelling than it could have been any colonel.
Right.
It's the colonel, not a colonel, but the colonel. And I think that also. So then you have the broken bottles embedded in the walls around the house to scoop the kneecaps from a man's legs or cut his hands to lace. So you're not in a world where you're open to, there's a class element here, and not a friendly one. On the windows there were gratings like those in liquor stores. We had dinner, rack of lamb, good wine, a gold bell calling the maid. Then you have the maid, green mangoes, salt, a type of bread. And then he says, how are you enjoying the country? I was asked how I enjoy the country. And a brief commercial. The commercials were in Spanish, even though it's English language.
Well, that's when you're selling stuff.
Yeah, you're selling stuff. And then his wife took everything away. So the maid didn't, the wife did, which is sort of interesting. There was some talk then of how difficult it had become to govern. The parrot said hello on the terrace. The colonel told it to shut up and pushed himself away from the table. Pushed himself from the table. My friend said to me with his eyes, and this is where I think it gets very chilling. My friend said to me with his eyes, say nothing. The colonel returned with a sack used to bring groceries home. He spilled many human ears on the table. They were like dried peach halves. as in the fruit of the poison tree. And there is no other way to say this. He took one of them in his hands, shook it in our faces, dropped it into water glass, and it came alive there. I am tired of fooling around, he said. As for the rights of anyone, tell your people they could go fuck themselves. He swept the ears to the floor with his arm and held the last of his wine in the air. Something for your poetry, no? He said. Some of the ears on the floor caught this scrap of his voice. Some of the ears on the floor were pressed to the ground.
Wow.
Yeah, it's searing.
So I'm not going to invite the Colonel over for dinner anytime soon.
Yeah, right.
Well, I think it's a question of
You
whether
don't
he
wanna
would
do
invite
that?
you. There's something my husband said to me just before I left this morning that was sort of interesting. He said to me, so how do you deal with poetry of witness that sears the way this sears? And yet when you're reading to people, and there is always in the world this going on. So the witness goes on and on and on and on. And how do you do anything but create despair? And that, I think, is one of our questions if we're writing, is how do you address the horrible, the dark side, and not leave only despair, which is not helpful.
Or why does the United States try to hold himself to a higher standard of morality while they condone their activities in Nicaragua and El Salvador and other places?
I recommend Al McCoy's books to you.
Al McCoy has a
Yeah.
very good book on.
There's
on
a new
the-
one out on
yes.
empires.
Yeah, it's very good.
Our empire versus British
Well, it's
empire
Washington
versus...
lying all over again.
Yes, yeah, and it's a question of the different ways empires rule. And I have to say, having been anti-war and many other things, there are places and times, though, where empires in all their horribleness may have kept people from killing each other ethnically, like thinking of Yugoslavia and places like that. You know, they created horrible conditions. First of all,
Iraq.
they divided people, and perhaps having created those empires, then when they fall apart, it can be more brutal.
Compare the Brits in India to Americans, various places in Central America.
Montana.
Yeah, there you go.
I'd like to, and if I may, you may want to get there later, but I was looking at those last lines. Something for your poetry, no? He said, some of the ears on the floor caught the scrap of his voice. Some of the ears on the floor were pressed to the ground. It's almost, you know, maybe that is despairing, but it's, the Colonel's mocking the notion that she's going to go back and write poetry on this. And she may herself be questioning the poetic enterprise here of, you know, feeling inadequate. You know, what is her role? It's just going to be, you know, literally an ear to the ground and then report back. On the other hand, the fact that she does give witness in such a powerful way does want to compel one to action, to do something about this particular person.
My thought of what you were saying is sort of different. He doubted her ability, her poetry, to do anything that affects him at all or what he does. But she knew that there were ears. And her poetry would be heard by ears in the world that he couldn't prevent. Even killing the people and cutting their ears off did not prevent those ears and those people from hearing what she was witnessing. That was the way.
And
I
yet,
looked at it.
it didn't improve
Well,
Salvador.
you know, I had
Look at Salvador today.
This is sort of an aside, but I worked for the Wildlife Conservation Society, and they got a grant from USAID, and they went into El Salvador, and they were supposed to be carrying out wildlife educational function. But I was very upset that they were going to waste their money going to El Salvador, knowing what was going on there at the time. And I was sort of outbid on that one, but they
the
would
idea
take,
was compromised
yeah,
a lot
but
of
they
times.
would take money, go anywhere if they thought there was an animal wildlife conservation element that they could profit from, and they were in El Salvador, and I said, why are you in El Salvador? They have no wildlife in El Salvador. They just have, it's hooligans' land. You know, I was very upset, but I was outbid on that issue. But you know, I was also a member of.
There's also eyes on the ground.
Yeah,
you know?
I was also a member of Amnesty International, and I would go to their meetings. And this was when I was living in Geneva, and it was like trading stamps. You know, I'll give you 2 victims in El Salvador for 3 victims in Peru, and you make these testimonials to the various hotspots of pain and suffering. And I thought it really felt like a stamp club. They were trading around. And what were these lawyers and high-minded individuals doing, sending letters to these countries objecting to the operation, when, you know, the U.S. government was supporting all this? It was just insane, I thought.
Well, this was our empire, and all of us are sitting here, regardless of our beliefs, we benefited, you know? And that is the irony of being sort of stuck inside the beast. And does it help to know or not know? And if so, can you modulate at least some of the viciousness?
Well, you know, like Nicaragua was a case in point where all of the beef that goes into McDonald's hamburgers come from free-ranging cattle in Nicaragua. That's the major connection. And I found it very unsettling that we were involved in perpetuating a Vino government, and
we weren't involved, we set it up.
Yeah, we set it up. Yeah, it was.
I mean, all these places have their complicated histories, but you know, Ernesto Cardenal has the poem with Walker in Walker in Nicaragua, and also with I think it's Squirer, who was one of his supporters. And I don't know if you guys know about Walker, but Walker was just prior to Civil War here. I think he was from Tennessee, and he moved an army and took over Nicaragua, wanting to establish a southern outpost of the United States and a slave nation, which it had not been.
Yeah.
And he did succeed to a point, and he killed the number of local natives, and then was overthrown. But this fellow Squirer wrote a travel poem about, you know, the wonderful, and it's quite luscious and secular about the jungles and the women and this and so in Nicaragua, and yet he was traveling with this brutal slave fellow, which was one of our early interventions in Nicaragua.
I'd like to point out that this poem was written in May 1978.
Yes.
So the futility of her having given witness to this horror may not have actually been present. I mean, this is when this issue was really heating up. You know, Reagan, this book came out in 1981, where the poem is, and then, you know, really exploded the whole issue of our relationship to Latin America. So,
yeah, and a lot of people said it's not poetry. You know, there's a big argument about whether it was poetry. Okay.
Yeah. And then a more minor point is, I marvel at the skill of just the detail. The colonel returned with a sack used to bring groceries home. But were they filled with groceries? No, ears. So how, you know, just that bringing in of violence just casually as part of everyday life for this person.
Yeah, the sort of quotidian element of this is, you know, here's a sack of ears.
And there was subtle description of his security, and the fact that he was saying, gosh, it's really getting harder and harder to cut people's ears off. I have to have screens on my windows, and I have to keep a pistol right by my side because somebody might get me.
I mean,
it's so stark in this. It's so
yeah,
clear.
I mean,
the colonel feels threatened.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, and for good reason.
For all
He
these
has
nice
general
things that he
fear.
had in his house,
General fear.
how could he enjoy them? You could see he wasn't really enjoying them. His house was locked up, and
he was
had
enjoying
people trying to climb up his walls to kill him because he had glass in his walls to keep people from
But you know,
getting to him.
these were years, this is slightly after, but these were years I lived in Houston. And, you know, I knew people in oil companies and their families, and they all lived like this. They didn't have ears necessarily, but they had the walls with glass in them, and they had the attack dogs, you know, which one of them was, you know, my neighbor, and that dog jumped my sister at one point, you know, so it was the way of the American empire living abroad, and oil was certainly core to the, you know, empire.
Remember what our president said? He didn't know how hard it was to govern. It was a big surprise to him that he couldn't walk out of the White House and walk down, you know, Potomac Avenue.
You're talking about the
and
present
talk to all
fellow?
these folks.
Yeah.
How hard, I don't think
How
he's
hard it
realized
is to
yet.
govern.
He can say that, but he hasn't governed at all. But,
I love the image too of ears coming to life.
yes,
Yeah.
The
like they're
poetic
listening.
ears.
Yeah.
And as if that is going to be the vehicle by which she's heard, and will render the voice of poetry, of witness.
That's the power
And
of
it's
poetry.
interesting, but
People are gonna hear.
remember in the things they carried, there is a section where you have the guys that are going into the caves and the guys that are really in the deep boonies, and the ears that they were collecting.
They collected ears.
Yes.
And in the BBAW protests, they admitted to that, some of them.
Yeah.
This is kind of a stark question, but you were in Vietnam.
Yes.
How many of your guys used to bring ears back?
I wasn't, most of us who were in Vietnam weren't in that territory.
Even those were the deep boony guys.
Well, I dealt with special forces, and I know the special
even-
forces used to do that. They put them in their pocket.
That's right. But you were aware that this was going on.
Did you stay stoned the whole time you were there?
No, actually, I don't want to get off on my story again, but people bring it up. But actually, I was a Presbyterian, so I had done drugs at Cal, and I had sworn them off. So when I was in Vietnam, I was reading books and meditating.
Oh.
And the gang was getting stoned and drunk and every other thing, but they tolerated me. They liked me.
Yeah.
There were young guys that come up to me and talk to me about stuff.
No,
But
there
I
were many
actually didn't do
stories.
anything.
Yeah.
I meditated and ran
Yeah.
when I was in Vietnam.
No, there were many, many stories. I mean, I knew somebody who was in the Air Force in Nam, and I saw him on leave, and he was talking about when they would fly to drop bombs. There was such confusion that they would call out, you know, something about the position, and our guys on the ground would send up flares. And what they would do is they'd fly around till they found a black spot. No flares, and drop their bombs. Well, you know,
right.
I mean, you know.
On what?
Yeah, exactly. And this is late in the war, but
It's you know, I wore a black. The most courageous thing I did in Vietnam was to wear a black armband in solidarity with the November 15th protest in '69.
that was
When people were in the
early,
streets, remember that one? And that, you know, it just confused the brass. I learned something from doing it.
No, I mean
Yeah, but what about, you know, you were talking, aren't debates about whether this is poetry or not kind of scholastic?
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you.
Well,
I think so. I think it is. I mean, I think when you have something like this that you're witnessing, it is important that you are able to rhetorically say it with some power. And sometimes you can say it in poetry. I'm trying to think of the fellow. Robert Haas has a book out about essays and things. And in one of the essays, he's referencing a fellow whose name I have to pull up because I'm an idiot and I'm forgetting. But it's somebody who's also written about the dark state, which makes me feel a little ambivalent. But But he is a Canadian who has come from a very wealthy class, and he also taught both history and English at Berkeley and other places. But he has a poem that is sort of Pound-like in that it attempts to witness through, not through things like this, but through the intellect of what is the empire. But it's also very personal, and it's written in terza rima. So it's written, and it's quite lovely language, because it also references his boyhood. There's a very lyric element, and all of which he's parsing the American Empire in a really interesting way, because he was from Montreal, and where he summered, one side of the lake, he calls it, and I should know the geography better, but and the other side was the American side, and it was clearly where, our very upper class and also CIA folk. So they had almost no names on the mailboxes, and he just pulls this out, these memories, and then pulling through what all this means and what were their families like, these people that were CIA that were doing these things. And there are these stories that run through it. And then he moves, and the basic thrust of it is a slaughter in Indonesia that he's referencing. So it's world focused, but it is lyric and beautifully written, and it looks like a poem. This doesn't look like a poem, because it's a paragraph.
But I think the prose poem form has a function. It conveys meaning as well, and the fact that it is like sort of discursive, it conveys you in. I don't know how you could write a lyrical poem about the ears on the ground. Maybe you could, but almost would be offensive. But
there are so many things you could have written about.
Really, tighten it, breaks it. And in the book, it looks more poetic because it's justified on both sides.
The way you present it, would have casual meaning that way.
I mean, there is a poem called The Visitor in here, and I think this complements what's being said. It says, in Spanish, he whispers, there is no time left. It is the sound of scythes arcing in wheat, the ache of some field song in Salvador, the wind along the prison, cautious as Francisco's hands on the inside, touching the walls as he walks. It is his wife's breath slipping into his cell each night while he imagines his hand to be hers in a small country. And then there's a break. There is nothing one man will not do to another.
Pretty much.
So there's that, and this looks like poem.
Unfortunately, it's true.
It is true.
Should we do final thoughts?
Yeah, someone else want to sum up?
It's not a poem.
What?
It's not a poem, but it's a beautiful, beautiful political statement, and the way she wrote it is much better than a New York Times article on this guy.
But it is a poem. I will argue that it is a poem because it uses so many. It may not have line breaks.
It does. I'm kidding you.
But I mean,
the next one
okay, but I'm going to take it
on.
on.
Any stretch of the imagination.
I disagree completely, but that's next time.
It is a poem.
There will be no disagreement.
All right, no disagreement.
Okay, what I didn't pull out is the way she uses imagery, the way she uses the sonics and the all the elements except line breaks are there. But of course, really fine prose may have that too.
So it's a continuum.
That's why they're called prose poems.
So now,
I have one that's like this.
Not Whitman.
All right.